There was a time when his silence drove me mad. Every time I opened up, he'd just listen, no interjections, no advice, no immediate comfort. Just stillness. And I hated it. It made me feel alone, unseen, like he didn't care enough to react. I used to beg for something, anything to fill that space. A nod, a word, a sigh. But all he gave me was presence. And back then, I thought presence wasn't enough. I didn't understand that being heard doesn't always sound like words. He never interrupted. Never tried to finish my thoughts. I'd cry, rant, spiral, and he'd just sit there, still listening with the kind of focus that felt unbearable. I mistook it for coldness. I mistook it for detachment. I didn't realize that silence, when intentional, can be louder than any comfort phrase. Instead, I resented him for not acting the way I'd learned love should look: urgent, dramatic, loud. I thought if he loved me, he'd say something. But he rarely did, and I hated him for it. Friends told me I deserved more, that he was emotionally unavailable, maybe even indifferent. They told me real love shows up in texts, in calls, in long talks at 2 a.m., so I believed them. I started seeing his silence as failure, as absence. I wanted fireworks, feedback, emotional fireworks. I wanted to be reassured with noise. Instead, I got quiet mornings, thoughtful glances, a man who rarely explained himself but never once left. And yet, all I could see was what he wasn't doing. I remember the day I snapped. "Do you even feel anything?" I yelled. He looked at me, calm, unshaken. "More than you think," he said. That was it. No argument, no raised voice. Just a man too rooted to be pulled into my storm. I thought he was hiding. I didn't know that sometimes silence is a boundary, a form of respect, a way to not make it about him. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted emotion, not depth. And when I didn't get it, I walked away thinking I deserved better. It wasn't until much later, with someone else, that I truly understood what he gave me. The new one talked a lot, reacted quickly, gave me all the "you're rights" and "I understands" I thought I wanted. But somehow I still felt alone. His responses were loud but empty. He listened to reply, not to understand. And for the first time, I missed the quiet. I missed the man who didn't try to fix me, who held space instead of filling it. The silence I once hated had become the thing I craved most. The man I was with now had all the right words. He could mirror emotions like a script. He said, "I hear you," and that must be hard, like clockwork. But there was something hollow beneath it. I'd share something vulnerable, and he'd nod, respond, but his eyes would drift. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't sit in the silence between my words. He didn't stay, and it hit me: this wasn't listening. This was performance. And in that moment, I missed the man who never said a word, but never looked away. With him, silence didn't feel cold. It felt focused, like I was the only person in the world when I spoke. At the time, I resented that he didn't say much. Now, I'd do anything to feel that stillness again. The new guy rushed to respond. He filled every pause like silence made him nervous. And maybe it did. Maybe he wasn't afraid of what I was feeling. He was afraid of what he'd feel if he let it land. The first man. He let my words echo. He didn't plug them with noise. He held them. There's a kind of safety in being truly heard, not answered, not managed, just heard. I didn't know that feeling until I lost it. The man I once accused of being distant was the only one who ever gave me emotional space. I used to think his silence meant he didn't care, but now I see it meant he wasn't trying to center himself in my pain. He didn't need to be the hero. He just wanted me to have room to breathe. And once you've been held like that, nothing else feels like enough. Sometimes, when I was with him, I'd stop mid-sentence and say, "Aren't you going to say anything?" He'd look at me with soft eyes and respond, "I want to understand fully before I speak." Back then, I found that frustrating. Now, it feels like the highest form of love. The new one interrupts. He fixes. He offers clicks before I've even finished my thought. It's not malicious, but it's not mindful either. And now, I find myself longing not for answers, but for the rare grace of someone willing to wait. One night, in the middle of a conversation with the new guy, I found myself going quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew he wasn't really with me. His eyes glanced at his phone. His hand fidgeted with his drink. He nodded, but it was empty. That night I cried alone. And for the first time, I wasn't crying about this man, I was grieving the one I let go. The one whose silence used to frustrate me. The one who listened so deeply, I never had to repeat myself twice. The contrast became impossible to ignore. With him, the man I once walked away from, there was presence. Not the kind you post about. Not the kind that sparkles on anniversaries. But the kind that sits with you in your mess, steady, unafraid. The kind that doesn't flinch when you cry, doesn't try to cheer you up, just holds the storm with you. The new man. He panicked when I got emotional. He changed the subject. Cracked jokes touched my arm awkwardly, as if my sadness made him want to escape. I began to realize I had misunderstood love entirely. I used to chase words, needing affirmation to feel grounded. I wanted to be reminded constantly that I was wanted. But that's not love, it's insecurity asking to be coddled. The man I left never coddled me. He didn't perform romance, he embodied it. In how he remembered the things I forgot. In how he stayed calm when I tried to provoke him. In how he let me unravel without fear, without fixing. And suddenly his silence didn't feel like a flaw, it felt like a gift I threw away. There was a night I stayed up rereading old messages from him. There weren't many. He never texted to fill space. He didn't send morning clicks or empty good nights. But the few he did send, they were precise, thoughtful. One of them read, "You don't have to say everything. I'll stay here with whatever you can't name yet." I hadn't appreciated it then. I wanted emojis, paragraphs, declarations. Now I'd give anything for that kind of quiet understanding. That message said more than "I love you" ever could. Being with someone who talks all the time made me see the cost of shallow comfort. The new man was warm, attentive even. But his words were like sugar sweet, addictive, and gone too fast. They filled the silence but never reached me, never held me. I could feel his impatience when I paused. I could see him waiting for his turn to speak. And I realized I missed being interrupted by nothing. I missed the man who wasn't afraid of silence, who let it breathe between us until it softened everything. The hardest part was knowing I had blamed the wrong man. I had accused him of being distant when he was simply deep. I mistook his boundaries for coldness, his patience for disinterest. I didn't know how to receive stillness because I was addicted to noise. But now that I had what I thought I wanted, constant talking, emotional feedback, I felt emptier than ever. I didn't miss conversation, I missed connection. And sometimes, connection doesn't speak, it just stays. He had stayed, I had left, and that realization broke me. I started to notice patterns I hadn't seen before. With the new man, every disagreement turned into a performance. Raised voices, defensive tones, quick apologies that didn't mean anything. There was no pause between reaction and response, no space to breathe, to reflect. It was the opposite of what I had once hated. And yet it drained me more. With the man I left, there was tension too, but never chaos. He never raised his voice, never rushed to win. He let the space between us speak, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, I remember breaking down completely. I'd had a terrible day, exhausted, overwhelmed, brittle. I tried to open up. The new man listened, but something in his eyes flickered, impatience, maybe discomfort. He offered advice before I could even finish. "You just need to stop overthinking," he said. And just like that, I shut down. I smiled, nodded, and mentally disappeared. Because I didn't want solutions. I wanted stillness. I wanted what I once rejected, someone who could hold space without trying to fix me. That night, I lay in bed replaying an old memory. I was with him, my ex, and I'd said something raw, something I had never told anyone. He didn't say a word. He didn't touch me. He didn't even nod. He just looked at me and stayed. That silence felt infuriating at the time. But now I see it was sacred. He knew that moment wasn't about him. He knew that holding space wasn't about responding, it was about not leaving. And in all the noise of my current relationship, that kind of sacred space was gone. I started to envy the woman I had been with him, not because I was happier back then, but because I was heard, truly heard, even in silence. Even when I couldn't articulate my pain, he understood it, or at least he made me feel safe to sit in it. This new version of me, constantly explaining, justifying, repeating, I barely recognized her. She didn't feel strong. She felt small, defensive, overcompensating for a man who filled silence but never made me feel seen in it. And I couldn't unsee that. I realized then that I had confused attention with intimacy. The new man gave me attention, plenty of it. He commented on my outfits. He sent heart emojis. He told me I was beautiful. But I never felt emotionally safe. I felt observed but not understood. And that made me miss something I had once run from. The kind of silence that doesn't observe you but honors you. The kind of silence that says, you don't have to explain. I'll be here even in the quiet. That silence had once felt unbearable. Now it felt like home. I began revisiting the quiet moments I once called emptiness. The nights we sat together in silence, me scrolling, him reading. At the time, I thought we were drifting. I mistook his calm for emotional distance. But now I understand, he was giving me a world without pressure, a space where nothing had to be performed. We could exist side by side without needing to impress or entertain. And now, with someone who constantly filled the air with words, I realized how loud emptiness can feel when presence isn't real. There's a unique kind of grief that comes from realizing you had everything you needed, and you walked away because you didn't recognize it. I kept waiting for love to look like it does in movies, grand gestures, dramatic conversations, passionate arguments followed by breathless reconciliations. But real love, at least the kind he offered, was quiet. It didn't chase, it didn't dramatize, it just showed up, steady, unwavering. I thought that meant it wasn't deep. I couldn't have been more wrong. I didn't know then that real listening looks like stillness. It looks like someone choosing to remain calm so you can unravel safely. The new man didn't offer that. His listening came with impatience, with commentary. It felt like being on trial rather than being held. Every silence between us felt tense, like something needed to be said or fixed. But with him, with the man I once accused of emotional distance, silence had weight. It was solid, and now, in the absence of that, I felt unanswered. It took losing him to realize that his silence was his way of staying present. He wasn't avoiding me, he was allowing me to feel, to think, to breathe without interruption. He didn't try to direct the conversation, didn't try to manage my emotions. That kind of trust is rare. The belief that you can navigate your own storm, and that his job is not to steer your ship, but to remain near, in case you need anchoring. I used to see his silence as neglect. Now I see it as respect. I remember one particular night, he had asked me how I was, and I shrugged. I didn't want to talk. I expected him to push, to ask again, to coax it out of me. But he didn't. He just nodded and sat with me. He made tea, turned on a soft light. No pressure, no intrusion, just presence. That night I ended up opening up to him more than I ever had. Not because he asked, but because he waited. Patiently, without ego. That memory visits me often now, especially on nights when I feel completely alone, even in someone else's arms. The turning point came quietly, like most truths do. I was mid-conversation with the new man, explaining how I felt off, disconnected. He nodded, said all the right things. I get it, he said, you're just overthinking. And suddenly, I felt like a burden, like my inner world was too much, too messy. I missed the way he never tried to minimize what I was feeling. He never rushed to define it or dismiss it. He just let me feel it raw, unfiltered. That kind of space isn't passive, it's intentional, it's rare. I started to pull away from noise, from surface-level support, from voices that talked more than they listened. And as I did, his presence, the one I left, began echoing louder in the quiet. I remembered how he would sit with me in my spirals, not to fix them, but to bear witness. That was his love language. Not rescue, not repair, but respect. And the more I compared it to what I had now, the clearer it became. I hadn't been ignored back then. I had been honored. And I had called it cold. The new man loved to talk things through, always wanted to work it out, even when I wasn't ready. But that wasn't for me, it was for him. To ease his discomfort, to make the silence go away. I didn't realize how much I'd taken for granted the man who didn't flinch when I went quiet. He didn't need constant resolution. He understood that some wounds need time, not discussion, that healing often happens in stillness. And now, in all the let's talk about it's, I found myself craving that stillness again. I remember one time, I couldn't find the words to explain why I felt distant. With the new man, that became an argument. "You need to communicate," he said, as if clarity was something I could produce on command. But he had never demanded words. He knew emotions don't always arrive in neat sentences. He gave me space to stumble through the fog without pressure. That kind of patience felt invisible when I had it. But now it's the loudest absence I carry. In missing him, I began missing parts of myself too. The softer version of me that didn't feel rushed. The one who could sit in a room with someone and say nothing, yet feel deeply connected. With him, I never felt forced to perform. I didn't have to translate my emotions into digestible lines. I could just be. And I didn't realize how much safety that gave me until it was gone. Now, every time I feel unheard despite all the words, I long for that quiet space I once fled from. I long for him. There's something haunting about realizing the man who gave you the most emotional safety is also the one you pushed away. I thought I wanted more words, more expression, more emotion. But what I truly wanted was to feel seen without having to beg for it. And now, in a relationship full of noise, full of validation on the surface, but hollowness underneath, I see it so clearly. He didn't try to impress me. He simply showed up. And when I was too loud to hear the quiet, I mistook his stillness for absence. I remember testing him back then, withholding affection, making careless remarks, waiting to see if he'd break, if he'd fight to prove he loved me. But he didn't. He didn't play the game. He let me drift, but he never chased. That used to make me feel rejected. Now I understand it was self-respect. He wasn't unloving. He just refused to beg. And that strength, that refusal to fold under my manipulation, it's what I miss most. He was the first man I couldn't bend, and the last one who ever made me feel fully safe. When a man doesn't need you to feel whole, it's easy to confuse that with indifference. I did. I wanted to be needed. I wanted to feel irreplaceable. But he didn't need me. He chose me. And I didn't understand then what a powerful thing that is. Now I'm with someone who needs constant reassurance, who panics at distance, who clings. And I should feel important, but instead I feel suffocated. I miss the man who didn't orbit around me, but stood steady, letting me come and go until I learned how to stay. Sometimes love doesn't look like holding tight. Sometimes it looks like standing still while the other person figures themselves out. That's what he did. He gave me freedom, even when it cost him closeness. I didn't realize it at the time. I thought love meant pursuit. But he loved differently. He didn't chase when I tested his patience. He didn't collapse when I pulled away. He simply stayed grounded. And now, after all the chasing and catching and losing, I finally understand the cost of what I called too calm. I used to wish he'd fight harder for me. Say the things, do the things, react the way I thought he should. But he never did, and now I see why. He was never going to fight for my chaos. He was waiting for my clarity. He didn't want a version of me that needed drama to feel alive. He wanted the woman underneath that noise, and he gave me every chance to become her. But I walked away, and now, every moment with someone who gives me everything but peace only reminds me what I lost. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes from being constantly surrounded by noise. Conversations, compliments, even affection, they all blur together when they're not rooted in depth. The man I'm with now never stops talking, never stops performing what love is supposed to look like. And yet, I've never felt more unseen. Because it's not about the volume, it's about the presence. And the man I left, the one who rarely spoke, had the kind of presence that made even silence feel like intimacy. I started craving solitude in ways I never had before, not because I wanted to be alone, but because I wanted to feel something real. The constant commentary, the shallow comfort, it all began to wear thin. And in that quiet, when I finally allowed myself to sit with the ache, It wasn't just him I missed. It was me, the version of myself that existed around him. I was softer then, more reflective, less reactive. He never tried to tame me. He just held a space where I didn't have to scream to be heard. It's ironic, really. I used to complain that he wasn't emotionally expressive, that he didn't give me enough. But now, I realize he gave me everything I truly needed, just not in the language I understood at the time. His stillness taught me patience. His silence taught me to listen. His restraint forced me to meet myself. And in contrast, every overly expressive, emotionally frantic man since has made me feel like I'm drowning in empty words. I used to run from quiet love. Now it's the only kind I believe in. There was a peace in him that I didn't know how to value. A quiet confidence, a calm self-sufficiency that didn't demand attention. I thought he lacked emotion, but really, he mastered it. He didn't spill it everywhere, didn't weaponize it, didn't make me responsible for soothing it. And now that I've lived with men who do all of that, who fall apart and expect me to put them back together, I see it. He was strong in ways I didn't understand then. And now, that kind of strength feels mythical. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became he didn't love me with noise because he didn't need to prove it. His love was in how he remembered what I said in passing, how he adjusted his rhythm to mine without asking me to change, how he made room for my emotions without drowning in them. I mistook that stability for lack of passion. But now I understand anyone can make your heart race. Very few can make it feel safe. And safety, I've learned, is the rarest form of intimacy. My friends didn't understand him then, and they still wouldn't now. They saw a man who didn't gush, didn't post, didn't proclaim, and they whispered words like emotionally unavailable, too passive, not romantic enough. I let their voices echo in my mind. I doubted him. I doubted what we had, because I thought love had to be witnessed by others to be real. But now I know some of the truest things don't need to be performed. They just need to be felt. And his love, it was always felt. Looking back, I realize I craved validation more than connection. I wanted the kind of relationship that looked good on the outside. The captions, the couple photos, the story-worthy moments. And he wasn't that man. He didn't curate his love for display. He didn't decorate it with grand gestures. He built it quietly, moment by moment, gaze by gaze. I used to think that was boring. Now I see it was the foundation I've never been able to rebuild with anyone else since. What we had wasn't dramatic, but it was profound. It wasn't built on high highs and low lows. It was built on presence, patience, and peace. But peace is a language few people understand. Most crave chaos and call it passion. I did too, once. I wanted to feel something constantly, even if it meant emotional instability. But now, in the aftermath of emotional roller coasters that left me burnt out and empty, I remember the steadiness of him. And I finally understand that's the kind of love that lasts. I used to test him because I didn't understand how he could love me without needing me. It made me feel disposable, replaceable. But now I see it wasn't detachment, it was completeness. He wasn't loving me to fill a void. He was offering love from a place of wholeness. And instead of celebrating that, I tried to provoke something more dramatic, because I mistook tension for truth. Now I see that real love doesn't make you doubt. It gives you silence, not because there's nothing to say, but because there's nothing to prove. Now, I hear other women speak about their relationships, how they crave stability, maturity, presence. And I want to tell them I had that. And I left, not because he failed me, but because I didn't recognize what I had. We're so conditioned to chase the loudest thing in the room that we ignore the quiet man in the corner, the one who sees you, hears you, and doesn't need to be seen doing it. I didn't just walk away from a man, I walked away from a mirror. And I've been searching for that reflection ever since. Healing didn't come in the arms of someone new. It came in the quiet moments alone, when I finally had to face the truth. I hadn't been unloved. I had been misunderstood, mostly by myself. He didn't show love the way I expected, but he lived it. Through consistency, through patience, through presence. The kind of love that doesn't dazzle you with sudden light, but warms you slowly, steadily, the kind that holds when things fall apart and doesn't disappear when you're hard to love. I didn't see it then. I do now. One afternoon, months after we ended, I sat on the floor of my apartment reading an old journal. Entry after entry, I noticed something every time I described him. I wrote about how I felt, not what he said. Because truthfully, he didn't say much, but he made me feel grounded, respected, safe. And somehow I let all of that slip away because I was chasing words. But words can lie. Feelings rarely do. And now I'd trade every "I love you" I've heard since for just one more evening of that silent, anchoring presence. I used to think love was something loud, something you could point to, something you could prove. But now I understand real love doesn't always show up with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up as someone sitting across from you, unshaken by your chaos. Someone who lets you fall apart, then hands you quiet instead of advice. That was him. He never told me how to fix myself. He never tried to become my solution. He just stayed unmoving, unfazed until I was ready to rise on my own. In a world that constantly tells us to perform, to overshare, to over-explain, he was a still point. A reminder that we don't always need to be doing to be worthy of connection. With him, I didn't have to be impressive. I could just be. And that kind of space changes you. It strips away the armor. It shows you the parts of yourself you've never sat with. I ran from that kind of stillness because it felt too raw. But now, after all the noise, I long for it. I long for him. Sometimes I wonder if he ever looked back, if he ever missed me the way I miss him, not in the dramatic sense, but in those quiet, personal hours where everything slows down, when the world is asleep and only your regrets remain awake. I don't expect him to. He was never the type to chase the past. But I hope, somewhere in his stillness, he remembers me, not the version that wanted more noise, but the one who finally learned to listen, to herself, to silence, to the love she once misunderstood. I carry him with me in subtle ways now, in how I pause before responding, in how I let silence stretch instead of rushing to fill it, in how I sit with someone else's pain without trying to fix it. I didn't realize he was teaching me while we were together, but he was. Every moment he stayed calm, every time he didn't rush to speak, every time he let things unfold without judgment, he was showing me a new kind of love. Not reactive, not performative, just quietly present, and that presence still echoes in me. He was the first man who didn't need me to be more than I was. He didn't ask me to shrink. He didn't ask me to explain every feeling. He trusted me to feel, to unravel, to return. And that kind of trust taught me how to trust myself. The men after him taught me how to crave attention. He taught me how to build inner stillness. And in that contrast, I began to see clearly. Some people give you love that inflates your ego. Others give you love that fortifies your soul. His love was the latter, the real kind. The man I once thought didn't give enough gave me something no one else ever has, the mirror of emotional maturity. He never stooped to my outbursts, never retaliated with silence of his own. He didn't play the games. And at the time I resented him for it. But now I see it takes strength to hold your center when someone else is losing theirs. It takes discipline to stay kind without becoming soft. He had both. And he showed me, through who he was, the kind of woman I was capable of becoming. Now, I find myself less drawn to people who talk beautifully and more drawn to people who live quietly, with intention. He changed the way I listen, the way I notice, the way I love. I don't need constant words anymore. I crave presence, depth, slowness. And I owe that to him. He was the quiet before I knew how to appreciate quiet, the safe space I mistook for boredom. The strong foundation I thought was too plain, and it took losing him to realize that kind of love wasn't lacking. It was rare. Sometimes I wonder what he saw in me back then. I was restless, reactive, loud with my fear of being unseen, and yet he stayed, not to fix me, not to own me, but to hold space while I unraveled. That's a kind of love I didn't understand at the time, but I do now. And though I may never get the chance to thank him, I carry the lessons like sacred scripture. He didn't teach me with words. He taught me with restraint, with presence, with the kind of silence that doesn't abandon, but waits patiently for you to grow. I used to believe closure came in conversation, a final talk, a goodbye with clarity, mutual understanding. But with him there was no final scene, no dramatic ending, just a slow fade, a silence that was as graceful as it was painful. And now I understand why. He didn't need to prove anything, not even at the end. He didn't chase me when I left. He didn't try to explain his side. He let go the same way he loved, with dignity, with stillness, with the kind of quiet that stays long after the door closes. Sometimes I catch myself composing messages I'll never send, not to reignite anything, but to say, I see it now. To let him know that the silence I once resented became the very thing I grew into, that I finally learned how to sit with my feelings the way he used to sit with mine. That I understand now what he was doing when he didn't speak. He wasn't shutting me out. He was making room for me, for my fear, for my voice. And in that room I was supposed to meet myself. I just wasn't ready then. It took losing him and loving someone louder but emptier to understand that silence isn't the opposite of love. It's the container for it. The love I once judged as distant was actually the most respectful kind I've ever known. It asked for nothing. It demanded no performance. It simply stood still and waited to be recognized. I walked away because I thought I needed more. But more isn't always better. And sometimes the loudest heartbreak is realizing the love you left was already everything you needed. Now, when people ask what kind of love I want, I no longer describe flowers or poems or grand romantic gestures. I describe quiet mornings. Eye contact that doesn't rush. Someone who knows when to speak and when to simply sit beside you in silence. Someone whose steadiness anchors you when you feel like falling apart. I describe him not by name, not by memory, but by the way he taught me that true love doesn't always speak, it listens. And sometimes that's the loudest love of all. If I ever love again, I'll love like he did, without fear, without noise, without needing to be heard to feel seen. I'll love in stillness. I'll wait, not rush. I'll listen, perform. And if I never love again, that's okay too, because I was once loved in a way that reshaped me entirely. A love that left not through absence, but through presence so powerful it could stay without holding on. He didn't say much. But now, years later, I hear everything he was trying to tell me, and this time I'm finally listening.